everyone, and welcome to this video focusing on African American civil rights during the Black Power period, 1965 to 1968. So firstly, let's look at the situation that was in the 1960s. At this point, African Americans had de jure equal civil rights, so this means in law they had equal rights, political and legal, and this was due to the Civil Rights Act 1964 and the Voting Rights Act 1965. So this meant that the civil rights movement shifted onto de facto problems, so problems that were affecting daily lives, and this was poverty, employment, and education discrimination. 50% of black males aged 16 to 25 had criminal records, and only 16% of African American children were in integrated schools. African Americans were also twice as likely to be unemployed and face continued discrimination in accommodation. Incomes were also only 53% of the national average, so African Americans were earning half of what the average person would be earning. During the Black Power period, there were hundreds of major riots, and they pretty much always had to do with police brutality. In Los Angeles, 34 people were killed and $40 million worth of property damage was done. In Newark, the population was majority black, yet the police force was 89% white, and in Detroit, 43 people were killed. Especially after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, there were violent riots in over 100 cities across America. In 1967, President LBJ ordered the Kerner Commission, which was a report looking into what was causing these riots, and they all concluded that it was due to white racism. But LBJ ignored the report because he didn't want to lose his crucial white support. So now moving on to Malcolm X, who pretty much started the whole Black Power movement. Growing up, his parents were supporters of Marcus Garvey, so he grew up in a very civil rights household, and his father was allegedly murdered by white racists, so he had a lot of anger towards white people. He excelled in school, but he had to drop out after his white teachers continually told him that his goals of being a lawyer were unrealistic for him. He was imprisoned in 1946 for burglary, and while in prison he wrote letters to his brother who told him about this group called the Nation of Islam. And it's a religious group with very strict moral teachings, and Malcolm X became a member in 1948. But he left in 1964 after going public with the corruption of Elijah Muhammad, as he was having affairs with his mistresses, which went strongly against the moral code of the religion. Malcolm X's beliefs were pretty radical. He was a black supremacist, so he believed the superiority of blacks over whites, and he called for the complete separation and segregation of blacks and whites. So he wanted a self-sufficient and separate society just for black people. He also rejected nonviolence, as he believed that all violence was self-defense against the oppressive white people. So basically, he's the complete opposite of Martin Luther King, although they did have some similarities in that they were both really charismatic public speakers. Malcolm X's support came purely from the angry, younger, radical African Americans, whereas Martin Luther King was the more middle-class, southern, also white support. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, allegedly by Nation of Islam members. Although he had the really strong support of the more urban African Americans, he simultaneously increased support for Martin Luther King, because Malcolm X represented what would happen if the white people didn't support the peaceful Martin Luther King. He showed that African Americans were willing to be radical and violent if white people didn't start treating them equally. So the phrase Black Power emerged in the 1950s, but it was first used as part of the civil rights movement in 1966 by Stokely Carmichael, who was the leader of SNCC. It called for the rejection of non-violence and the exclusion of white people from the civil rights movement. In 1966, SNCC removed the non-violent part from their name and also expelled the white members, and then CORE did the same thing. Black Power also called for black supremacy and separation, just like Malcolm X, so it wanted a separate and self-sufficient black society, but it also called for social and economic change, such as the abolition of capitalism and the release of all black prisoners. This gave birth to the Black Panther Party in 1966, and it was formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and it was inspired by Malcolm X. Their main policies were the exclusion of white people, violence in the form of self-defense, their Patrol the Pigs campaign, where they would follow police cars around to make sure that they weren't using excessive force on black people or wrongly arresting people. They also called for economic improvement and welfare schemes to relieve poverty, and also they were quite a communist party. They also had the free breakfast for school children program, which was one of the most successful things, as they served over 20,000 meals per week to children for free. They also set up free health clinics across America for African Americans, which particularly dealt with sickle cell anemia. And they also got control of some school boards so that they could set up liberation schools which taught black history and black heritage. In 1967, their leader Huey Newton was wrongly arrested for the murder of a police officer, even though the bullet in the police officer was shot from a police gun. So he really clearly didn't do it, but they still arrested him. So this led to the Free Huey campaign, which was across America, and it was a huge campaign to free the leader of the Black Panthers. Also, the Black Panther newspaper had 250,000 copies in circulation, and in 1968, approximately 70% of black soldiers in Vietnam were reported to support Black Power. In 1968, the FBI had their eyes on destroying the Black Panther Party by infiltrating it and forging documents to bring down the leaders. So the achievements of the Black Power movement were mostly socio-economic. The black Muslims from the Nation of Islam are really important in rehabilitating black youth from drug addiction and crime in cities. They also opened 49 clinics across the USA and helped thousands of African Americans by providing free healthcare. The free breakfast program was extremely successful, serving 20,000 meals per week. And one of the biggest successes, I think, was the pride that they instilled in African Americans. Their campaign of Black is Beautiful and supporting the Afro hairstyle and just having self-respect and black role models really helped the black youths of America. They fought for black history and African heritage to get pushed into the schools, and they're partly responsible for the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which, although ineffective, did attempt to ban discrimination in terms of accommodation and real estate. And now the limitations of Black Power. It did divide the civil rights movement, which made the overall impact less effective, because they rejected nonviolence and they rejected integration, which were the main policies of Martin Luther King's and the more peaceful civil rights activists. This meant that white support was very up and down, because they didn't want to support the radical and exclusionist Black Power movement, but they also were put off from supporting the more peaceful activists like Martin Luther King. One of the more famous leaders of the Black Panther Party was Eldridge Cleaver, who actually ran for president. But he was a convicted rapist, which meant that many women were put off the Black Power movement, but also, it just generally discredited the whole party. Nation of Islam was a purely religious group, not political, which meant that they had a limited impact. The violent riots undermined the moral high ground that Martin Luther King had fought to establish, and this led to a lot of white backlash against civil rights movements. Also, the really radical policies of Black Power, such as the abolition of capitalism, the release of all black prisoners, and the ending of all wars, alienated even the liberal white supports, and this contributed to the Republican dominance of the presidency from 1969 to 1992. And overall, there was always this sort of contradiction about the Black Power movement, because they called for black supremacy and black separation and a self-sufficient society, but none of that could be achieved without the help of white politicians, so it wasn't really clear what they stood for and what they were against.